A proud heiress learns a hard lesson when she steps into the courtroom of a strict, no-nonsense judge. The day started like any other at Brookhaven District Court, with people filling the rows and chatting quietly while waiting for the session to begin. But this wasn't an ordinary case. The courtroom was unusually crowded because everyone wanted to see how Judge Marcus Reed would handle the infamous Charlotte Vance, a wealthy heiress known for her wild antics and disrespectful attitude. Charlotte arrived late, as expected, wearing a flashy outfit and oversized sunglasses. She strutted into the room as if she were at a fashion show, ignoring the seriousness of the proceedings. Her lawyer followed closely, clearly nervous, trying to avoid drawing more attention. The room grew quiet as people turned to watch Charlotte's dramatic entrance. She paused in the aisle, acting as though the world revolved around her. With an exaggerated gesture, she handed her purse to her lawyer, removed her sunglasses, and scanned the room with a smug grin. To her, this was all just an inconvenience, far beneath her importance. When Judge Marcus Reed entered the courtroom, the mood changed immediately. The chatter died, replaced by silence. In his late 50s, Judge Reed had a reputation for fairness, but also a firm intolerance for arrogance. Tall and commanding, he quickly assessed the room before sitting down. "All rise," the bailiff called. Charlotte hesitated, showing her displeasure with an exaggerated sigh before standing. Her expression made it clear she thought this was a waste of her time. The case was simple: multiple unpaid parking tickets and an incident of reckless driving that almost injured a pedestrian. What should have been a routine hearing, however, turned into something much bigger. As Judge Reed began reviewing the charges, Charlotte leaned back, crossed her arms, and rolled her eyes. Her behavior was a clear sign of disrespect. The spectators exchanged glances, sensing the tension. Judge Reed remained calm, speaking slowly and clearly as if challenging her to push further. Charlotte's defiance continued. She started tapping her nails on the table loudly, drawing attention. Her lawyer whispered to her, but she waved him off impatiently. "Ms. Vance, please confirm your identity," Judge Reed requested. Charlotte barely glanced up. "Yeah, that's me," she said with an air of indifference. A soft murmur swept through the room. Judge Reed paused, his sharp eyes fixed on her. "In this court, Ms. Vance, we expect respect. I suggest you adjust your attitude," he said, his voice calm but firm. Charlotte smirked. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied mockingly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Gasps rippled through the audience. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. Judge Reed pressed on. "Ms. Vance, do you understand the charges against you today?" She shrugged. "Not really. It's just a few tickets and some drama over nothing. This is a waste of everyone's time." The room went silent. Judge Reed's expression didn't change, but the weight of his gaze was palpable. Slowly, he set the file down and removed his glasses. "Ms. Vance," he said in a measured tone, "do you remember the incident that led to these charges?" Charlotte shrugged again. "Yes, some guy stepped off the curb. I honked, he moved, and that was that." Judge Reed raised his eyebrows. "Is that how you remember it?" He opened the file and addressed the court. "Let the record show that the pedestrian, Mr. Alan Pierce, is a 72-year-old retired firefighter. He was crossing the street legally when Ms. Vance sped toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his knee. He required medical treatment and still struggles with pain." Charlotte's confident demeanor faltered for the first time. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper urgently, but she ignored him. "I didn't hit him," she mumbled. "He was fine." Judge Reed's voice grew sharper. "Ms. Vance, do you still think this is no big deal?" Charlotte opened her mouth to respond but stopped when the judge raised a hand. "Your attitude shows a shocking lack of empathy. This court's purpose is not just to enforce the law, but to remind individuals like you of the consequences of their actions." The judge leaned forward. "In addition to paying fines and completing 150 hours of community service, you will spend the next month volunteering at the Oak Ridge Community Center. You will assist elderly residents who have faced hardships. Perhaps it will teach you some perspective." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Charlotte's face turned pale. "You're joking," she blurted. Judge Reed remained composed. "Ms. Vance, this is not a punishment. It is an opportunity for growth. Failure to comply will lead to far more serious consequences. Charlotte slumped in her seat, stunned. The session concluded, and the room began to clear. On his way out, Mr. Pierce glanced at Charlotte briefly, his expression calm. She avoided his gaze, her confidence shattered. Outside, reporters crowded around her, cameras flashing. For once, Charlotte had nothing to say. Her usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look of quiet realization. And so, in the courtroom of Judge Marcus Reed, justice and humility triumphed over privilege and arrogance. The days following Charlotte Vance's courtroom experience were a whirlwind of media coverage, public scrutiny, and personal reckoning. The once untouchable heiress found herself at the center of a story that resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. News outlets replayed clips of the hearing, dissecting Judge Reed's firm but fair ruling and Charlotte's stunned reaction. Social media buzzed with commentary. Some celebrated the judge's decision, while others questioned if someone like Charlotte could truly change. But amidst the noise, Charlotte was grappling with something entirely new: accountability. For the first time, she wasn't able to simply wave off the consequences of her actions. Her lawyer, family, and friends urged her to comply with the court's orders, warning her that failure would result in harsher penalties. Begrudgingly, she agreed. What choice did she have? The Oak Ridge Community Center was a far cry from the glamorous events and elite gatherings Charlotte was used to. The building was simple, with chipped paint and a faint smell of cleaning supplies. On her first day, she arrived in designer sneakers and a pristine workout outfit, hoping to breeze through the experience without getting her hands dirty. That illusion was shattered the moment she met Marjorie, the community center coordinator. Marjorie, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, had little patience for Charlotte's entitlement. "This isn't a charity gala where you get to show off and leave," Marjorie said bluntly. "Here you work, and if you're not willing to, you can explain that to Judge Reed." Charlotte bristled but bit her tongue. She spent her first day organizing donations, sorting through boxes of clothing and canned goods. It was tedious and unglamorous, and she hated every second of it. But as the days went on, something began to shift. One afternoon, Charlotte was assigned to assist during a community lunch. She begrudgingly served plates of food to elderly residents, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact. But then she met Mr. Delaney, a retired musician who used to play the saxophone in jazz clubs across the city. As she handed him his plate, he smiled warmly and said, "Thank you, young lady. You remind me of my granddaughter." The comment caught her off guard. "Oh, you're welcome," she mumbled, unsure how to respond. Mr. Delaney chuckled and began to share stories of his youth, his love for music, and the struggles he faced after retiring. Despite herself, Charlotte found herself listening. For the first time in a long while, she felt something other than annoyance or indifference. She felt curious. As the weeks went on, Charlotte began to form connections with the people she served. There was Elaine, a retired nurse who shared stories of saving lives during natural disasters, and Mr. Thompson, a former factory worker who loved playing chess and would challenge anyone who walked by. Slowly, Charlotte's perspective began to change. One particularly impactful moment came when she met Mrs. Ramirez, a woman who reminded her of Mr. Pierce, the pedestrian she had nearly hit. Mrs. Ramirez had a gentle voice but spoke with wisdom that commanded attention. She shared how difficult it was to navigate the city streets as an older adult, constantly worrying about drivers who didn't respect crosswalks or speed limits. "It's easy to forget there are people on the other side of your actions," Mrs. Ramirez said. "Until one day, you can't ignore it anymore." The word stayed with Charlotte long after she left the center that day. For the first time, she began to reflect on her choices, not just in the courtroom but throughout her life. She thought about how often she dismissed others' feelings, how rarely she considered the consequences of her actions. The weight of those realizations was uncomfortable, but it was also transformative. By the end of her court-ordered service, Charlotte was no longer the same person who had rolled her eyes in Judge Reed's courtroom. Her time at the community center had humbled her in ways she never expected. She had learned not just about the struggles of others, but also about the capacity for empathy and growth within herself. When her final day at Oak Ridge arrived, Marjorie handed her a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Change doesn't come easy, but it's worth it. Keep going. Marjorie. Charlotte felt a lump in her throat as she folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Thank you, she said softly. Later that week, Charlotte returned to the courthouse for a follow-up hearing. Judge Reed reviewed her community service report, nodding as he read Marjorie's detailed account of Charlotte's progress. When he looked up, his expression was firm, but not unkind. Ms. Vance, he said, it seems you've taken this opportunity to reflect and grow. That's all this court ever intended. Charlotte stood, her posture straighter, her tone no longer dripping with sarcasm. Thank you, Your Honor, she said sincerely. As she left the courtroom, reporters once again swarmed her. This time, she stopped and spoke, not with excuses or defiance, but with humility. I've made mistakes, she admitted, but I've learned a lot, and I'm working on being better. The cameras flashed, but for once, Charlotte didn't care about appearances. Her story had become more than a tale of privilege meeting justice. It was a story of redemption and the power of empathy to change even the most hardened hearts. And so, Charlotte Vance stepped out of the courthouse, not as the spoiled heiress she once was, but as someone finally ready to face the world with a little more understanding and a lot less entitlement.